Around the end of April 2013, I found an ad on Craigslist for an apartment for rent. I called the phone number and talked to what sounded like an old black man. He gave me another phone number to call, and it was a woman named Lorice who lived at the rooming house. So I made an appointment to look at the rooms they had for rent at 346 Derby Avenue the next day around noon. It was an old tenement house that rented rooms where you shared the bathrooms and the kitchen with the other renters. So I showed up at 346 Derby Avenue and met Lorice and Lynn. They were two middle-aged women, approximately 45 years old, and they were both still in nightgowns. They showed me the small room for rent right next to theirs, and my first concern was sharing such a close living space with two available women. The bottom line was that my wife wouldn't like the living arrangements, so I asked Lorice to show me the basement apartment they also had for rent, and we went downstairs. They said only one other guy would live downstairs in the apartment with me, but that he drank and would sometimes blast his music late at night. But still, I took the room downstairs because it was something that I could afford at $150 per week. So I met Rob Mailet, who was my roommate down there, and he said he worked as a cook at the Italian Pavilion restaurant in Derby, Connecticut. He'd usually sleep until about 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He would wake up, go to work, and always return later at night with a case of beer and cans, get drunk, and blast the stereo, but I just ignored him. When I first moved in there, Rob attempted to get me to hang out with him several times, but I avoided him. The apartment was a huge mess, with lots of stuff left over from the other tenants. So I began to clean the place up, and Rob would walk over to me, for example, while I was raking the backyard, and he'll guzzle cans of beer and play his guitar and try to get me to hang out with him. So I found Rob to be slightly crazy and an unlikable guy who was wasting his life away drinking and drugging, especially when he continued to offer me beer dozens of times, even though I tell him I quit drinking and been sober for 1.5 years. After a couple months of living there, Rob attempted to intimidate or bully me, whereupon I reacted with anger, and he retreated into his room. After that, Rob had more friends over, and this included an approximately 47-year-old Italian guy named Vinny, who lived upstairs, a Spanish guy named Jose, about 38 years old, and a younger black girl, approximately 24 years old. So I'd walk out of my room late at night, 1 or 2 in the morning, and see this group sitting in a circle, not saying anything to each other, with apparently nothing to do. They weren't watching TV, they weren't talking, they were just sitting in these wooden chairs in a circle, not saying anything. So it seemed kind of awkward and a little weird to me, but when I'd walk past, they would try to make introductions, but I just went to grab something out of the fridge or use the bathroom, and I just went back to my room not wanting much to do with these characters who looked like losers and sleazebags. So basically I wanted nothing to do with Rob or his buddies that he'll bring home late at night. And instead I'll get up early in the morning, get the newspaper for the classified section, and also look for work on the internet. I'd fill out applications and then go hiking after lunch. I'd hike until around dinner time, return home, make something to eat, call my wife, and go on the internet until I went to bed. Besides visiting a couple of friends in Danbury, Connecticut area, and making videos to market the book I wrote, that was most of my schedule. Then one day Lynn walks downstairs and knocks on the door. I answered the door and her first question was, "Is Rob home?" "He might be. I think he's in his room. You want to go in and see him?" "No," she said, looking nervously around me at his closed door. I stepped out on the stoop and asked her what she wanted, and she asked if I wanted to go out dancing with her. I told her, "Look, if I wasn't in a relationship with my wife, I'll definitely go out with you." I told her that I thought she was pretty and had a lot of guts asking me out like that, and I liked that. And then I said, "Why don't you ask Rob? He doesn't seem to have a girlfriend." And she said something about Rob not being her type. So Lynn comes back about a month later, knocks on the door, and she asked me out again. I told her that I was still in a relationship with my wife, so the answer was the same. And she said, "Oh, too bad." And then begins to talk about her ex-husband and daughter. She said her ex-husband molested her daughter. I asked her if she called the cops, and she said she did, but the cops wouldn't do anything because her daughter wouldn't press charges. I asked her how old her daughter was, and she told me 16 years old, I believe. And I said, "Well, she's still a minor, and I think you should have something to say about pressing charges, wouldn't you?" And she responded with, "Well, the cops won't do anything. I've already tried with them." So I asked her about her husband, and Lynn says since he's the one who makes most of the money, her daughter still lives with him, and she is forced into living on Tenement Row here. I responded with, "You live here in this shithole while your husband gets away with that?" "Yeah," she said, smiling strangely and not looking too upset with what she was telling me. And I said to her, "I'm really sorry to hear all that, Lynn, and I really don't know what to tell you." Then she said, "I wish I knew someone who would beat my husband's ass," and hinted that she wanted me to help her with that. "Look, Lynn," I responded, "I would like nothing more than to help you, but if I get one more arrest while under probation, I have to do 3 years in jail mandatory." So to cut to the chase, I didn't believe her story because she was acting funny while she told it, and I thought it seemed like some sort of setup, maybe trying to get me in a fight with an ex-boyfriend or an old enemy or something, because she began to act in a manipulating manner. So I cut the conversation short and I went back inside. Sometime later, Rob showed me a photograph of a girl and said this girl was his daughter. The girl was 14 or 15 years old in the photograph and looked exactly, and I mean exactly, like Lynn. There wasn't just a resemblance, the girl looked like a 15-year-old Lynn. A week or two later, I got home one day and I saw Vinny, the tenant who lives upstairs and Rob's friend, standing in front of her house. And usually Vinny just seemed like this older dorky guy who would walk around slowly in a slouched manner. He was approximately 47 years old. When he'd visit Rob, Vinny would usually just sit at the table using Rob's cigarette rolling machine to roll his bag of tobacco. Vinny usually seemed very meek and passive, but that day, Vinny looked like someone else entirely. His whole personality and demeanor had changed. That day, he was glaring at me as I walked by. His eyes were pitch black and his mouth was hanging open. He looked demon-possessed. He honestly looked like a vampire. "You all right there, Vinny?" I asked him.
"Yeah."
He made a strange noise. I walked past him and went inside. After that time, I noticed Vinny a couple times switch or turn like that. In his normal state, he would kind of slouch around, not making eye contact. To say the least, he had a serious case of multi-personality disorder, but from what I knew about the cult, Vinny acted as though he was demon-possessed. I also saw Rob Mailet look like this a couple of times. He'll get a blank, robotic stare in his icy blue eyes. I also saw Lorice behave in this fashion. I'd be coming or leaving, and I'd see her standing on the front stoop, staring at me with this reptilian look in her eyes. She was completely changed from her normal self into this evil-looking person. Lorice was supposedly the property manager at 346 Derby Avenue, and that she collected the rent for the landlord, Joe Jackson, and then gave you a rent receipt. I went to pay the rent one day, and I knocked on the building's front door. Lorice answered, and a little black girl walked up behind her, and Lorice shouted at the little girl,
"Go stand against the wall."
All the little girl did was walk up to see who was at the door, and Lorice began to shout at her in a very cruel tone. I didn't like how she spoke to the little girl, and I asked Lorice, "Is that your daughter?" And she said, "No, it's my friend's kid." Now, I don't know about any of you, but I don't scream at any kids that way, and I definitely couldn't see myself babysitting my friend's kid, and when she follows me around to scream at her, "Go stand against the wall." It was very creepy and seemed as if Lorice was used to controlling kids in that manner, and it was more like she was talking to a prisoner of war than to a little girl.